everybody, and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado, recording this on April Fool's Day, April 1, 2021. This interview was recorded a while back with Laura D., who's doing some really cool stuff in Hawaii and has been doing some retreat business stuff in Central America. And just really, I feel like I really appreciate Laura's approach and direction here. Some really, really cool stuff we get into in this recording, and I hope you like it. Laura D. has provided me a fair amount of support and help, and thankful for Dina Justice for linking us up. So I hope you enjoy this one with Laura D., and I will see you on the other side after a little bit of commentary. So this would usually be a Solidarity Fridays episode. We had some big technical issues, so we're gonna just do this one instead. So I wanted to throw out just a little bit of news and keep y'all in tune. So New York just passed the legalized cannabis thing. I think the Governor Cuomo signed off on it, and it'll be recreational, not just medical, which they've had for a little bit now. So that's great. Congrats, New York. Now we got to worry about getting everybody out of prison. Next up, David Wilder of Think Wilder just hit, I believe, 6 years of doing his quite regular updates. If you don't follow him on Twitter or on his blog, Think Wilder is what you can look for there. Yeah, there's a new study. We'll probably get into this next time. First controlled trial for the treatment of PTSD raises no safety concerns. Further research is needed to determine efficacy. So that's really cool. So no safety issues with PTSD people smoking cannabis. That's great. And a new research group, the Psychedelic Division, the Neuroscape Psychedelic Division at the University of San Francisco. They just got $6.4 million in private funding. Apparently, George Goldsmith, our friend over at Compass Pathways, donated a bunch there. I don't know who else is in the mix, but just worth noting who is there. Yeah, and I think I heard some rumor that a famous scientist is going to be there. So it looks like the founding director will be Robin Carhart Harris. So I wonder what's going on there. Is Robin leaving London to head to San Francisco? It looks like that's the case. So it's pretty cool. So yeah, more soon on that. I think that's it for news. That's just kind of the light commentary. Yeah, and what is the relationship between Harris and Compass? It's an interesting question. I'll try to ask him. I don't think George Goldsmith will come on the show, but maybe we'll try to ask for him to come on the show. What else? I think that's it. May 20, we kick off our next round of online ed. It's an 8-week program. The spaces are limited to 20 for each time slot. We have been selling a bunch of those already. So if you want to secure your spot, jump in soon. It's an amazing program, 47 total hours in the program, and you learn a ton. And it's beyond the clinical. It includes clinical, but transcends it for sure. So I think it's an amazing course. It's my favorite thing I do here at Psychedelics Today is teach it. In fact, I get to start teaching in about 45 minutes. So if you want to learn more, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And yeah, on with the interview. Here's Laura D., and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe here, joined by our guest, Laura Dawn. How you doing today, Laura?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me here, Joe.
Yeah, I'm happy to finally record with you. We had a really lovely phone call a few months back. I believe Dina Justice introduced us, and grateful for that. So I'm really just happy to be able to share your work with the audience. Cool. So I guess, Laura, way of getting in here, how do you like to kind of introduce your backstory, like how you got involved in this psychedelic space?
Well, I had my first high dose psilocybin experience when I was quite young. I was about 14 or 15 years old.
Oof.
And so I like to tell people that psychedelics hand raised me and forged me into the human that I am today. And so my experience with psychedelics goes back over 2 decades now. And they've really been at the forefront of my experience for the past, 20 plus years. And I'm really grateful for them in my life. And I grew up in a household with 2 entrepreneurs. And this was back before entrepreneurialism is like a thing now where everyone's an entrepreneur. And
Yeah, right.
right. And so it was interesting to grow up in a household where that was very much so the perceptual lens of reality that I was
Mm.
given. And there's a strong creative aspect in the way that my parents taught me to look at the world in terms of, possibility. And so I
Mm.
consider my father to be a visionary, and I very much so like to embody the visionary archetype. And he really taught me that whatever I saw in my mind, I could create in reality. And he was a great example of that. He would come up with all sorts
Mm.
of different ideas and talk about them. And then before I knew it, he was doing the thing and it was happening. And that was a huge influence for me. And then on my mother's side, I was so grateful that she just supported me in such a way that, even in through my teenage years, when I was working with psychedelics and very much so unconventional child. I didn't want to go to
Mm.
school. I didn't like the institutionalized schooling system. I found it really inefficient. I was the kind of kid that when everyone was going left, I'd be like, what's right? What's over the deep end on this side of things? And I always was kind of that kid that just beat to my own drum. And I'm so grateful that my parents always supported that in me so much. And I stopped going to high school and I actually got a tutor. And all I had to do was study for 45 minutes a week to equate to 5 days of classes.
Mm.
And so I just always really found it interesting to do things in my own way. And my mom used to always tell me, I really trust you and I trust your judgment. And she would, see me skipping school before I really decided to not go to school. She would run into me at the mall while I was supposed to be in class, for example, and she'd be like, "Hey, how's it going? Where are you coming from on this decision that you're making?" And she would always reinforce, like, "I really trust you. You have a good head on your shoulders." And
Mm.
so I really appreciated that those sort of beliefs that were really planted in me from an early age. And then even as I was working with psychedelics and I was pretty open about it with my parents, my mom really supported the decisions that I made. And so after university, I decided to leave my hometown of Montreal and I literally packed up a backpack and I left and I never went back. And I've been traveling all over the world for many years, really immersing myself in different cultures, experiencing the different ways that people live around the planet, and really just finding out what it means to be me, and what it means to be alive on this planet right now during this just such interesting times. And so my background, I actually got a degree in business and finance and entrepreneurship, and I've been an entrepreneur my whole entire life. And I think it's important to state too that I don't have like I think a lot of people, especially in the psychedelic space, see, business and psychedelics with such like a negative connotation. And I really look at it in such a positive way that we can learn how to work with psychedelics to help us think outside the box, to think more creatively and to come up with new novel solutions to some of the most challenging ideas or some of the most challenging issues that we face. And
Mm.
so, fast forward some years, I had my first ayahuasca experience in Hawaii, and I had a vision that night that I was going to find land and marry my husband to be. And then I met him that week, and we ended up buying this amazing, beautiful piece of land. And when we bought it, we didn't know that we were going to tap into a volcanic hot spring.
Mm.
And so we ended up building a beautiful retreat center. And I have been running transformational retreats for over 10 years. After business school and all the years of traveling, I really dove into so many healing modalities, Eastern philosophy, really looking at all the ways that, yeah, we can think differently. And especially so much time like spending in different cultures around the world, and just learning so much over the years. I started running retreats. I also went back to school and got a degree in holistic nutrition. And I wrote a book on food addiction because that was something that I had struggled with in my life. And psychedelics had really helped me heal from different various addictions and depression. And so we built this retreat center. We had been running retreats for many years and tapped into just an incredible source of hot water that flowed at 111 degrees. And several years ago, and then over this time, we had also been helping to facilitate other circles underground with plant medicines. And then a couple of years ago, the volcano erupted. And
Mm.
so we had spent all of these years building our retreat center. And then it was like the proverbial rug being pulled out from under us.
Yeah.
And so it was like a deep initiation. Actually, I just interviewed Dennis McKenna for my Psychedelic Leadership podcast, and he was talking about sacred plant medicines and COVID being like messengers from Gaia. And I really resonated with his framework around that. And so right before the volcano erupted, I had a really deep sit with ayahuasca. And that night, something really profound happened. I had this experience of just really surrendering my life to spirit and asking, like, okay, what is the next step for me on this path? I was kind of hitting my edge around running so many retreats and feeling like I was at another major sort of crossroad turning point in my life. And that night, was sitting in meditation and I received this full song like called Trust in the Great Unknown. And I picked up my guitar and I played the whole thing. It was just like direct from spirit. And the next morning, I woke up to earthquakes, and there was thousands of earthquakes that week until a big one hit. And then we were in our garden, and a friend ran over and said, that the road just split open in the subdivision right above our land, a couple miles above our land, and that
Mm.
lava just started flowing. And so, it was like one of those moments where time stood still. And it was so interesting is that the whole time we were evacuating for 2 weeks, all I had going through my head was this song, the 4 lines from this song, Trust in the Great Unknown. And I feel like there was just such a strong element of this plant medicine offering me, a message and guidance and wisdom. And it was like, I was about to be catapulted into just a very long, dark night of the soul experience. And there was this like pinhole of light at the end of that tunnel. And I'm grateful that I had that. It was like a lifeline for me to get through that experience. And it was a deep, deep initiation. And I think it's just a microcosm of the macrocosm of the real upheaval that we're experiencing on the planet today. And so I went into this really dark night of the soul for a long time. And while I was there, I was working really deep with medicines and really going into my own healing and also cultivating a framework that I had been working on for a long time. And I just got the message that it was time to really step out of the psychedelic closet. And I'd been feeling that call for a long time.
Mm.
And I was waiting for the right time. And a friend had told me one night that Michael Pollan was about to come out with his book. And it was like 6 months before the launch. And being in the health and wellness space, I had read his other books. So I was very familiar with his work. And as soon as I heard that he was writing a book on psychedelics, that night I had a dream. And it was like driving down the road and all the lights were turning green. And so I just knew that it was time, and someone had made us an offer for our retreat center while lava was flowing like a mile away from our land. And so we took that offer, and I just felt like, you know what? I don't have anything to lose at this point. And this was very much so my calling to introduce different ways that I've been thinking about the way that I work with psychedelics and having more of a public conversation around that. And so during this year and a half after the volcanic eruption, I just really went deep and created a unique framework. And I launched another retreat last New Year's with 40 people at a retreat center in Costa Rica.
Mm.
And, part of it is running retreats outside of the country where, the legalities are a little different and becoming more public about it, where I taught this framework, and it was an amazing experience. And then COVID hit.
Mhm.
And so we're all just rolling with the punches these days. And so now, after 10 years of running retreats, I'm taking a break and I'm back in graduate school, and I'm really happy to be here. And I also saw, as soon as COVID hit, and I knew right away that this was going to be for a long time. And so I just dove in, and I was like, okay, this is the time to really up all my skill sets. And I'm back in graduate school getting a master's degree in science. And the program is creativity studies and change leadership. And I'm particularly interested in how psychedelics and sacred plant medicines can help foster and facilitate creative thinking and creative problem solving. So it's really the area that I'm super interested in right now.
Yeah. It's a beautiful story. Thank you. It's the creativity angle, I think, is so important right now as we have all these convergent crises. And I do tend to agree with Dennis McKenna about these being like kind of messengers saying, hey, and Dennis phrases it kind of funny, right? Like, hey, monkeys, you don't actually run things here. Plants do. And, I kind of like
Right.
that. But I also like, let's not discount human creativity and power and ability to impact things. And we do have to understand that our creativity and our decisions, like everything from what we have for breakfast to what we wear, has a huge impact.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's just so much there and so much room for beautiful developments in humanity and as a whole and for individuals. Mm.
Mhm.
What kind of made you think about creativity? So in this way that you wanted to go back to school for it, to study it more?
Yeah. Well, it was just really coming on my radar in such a big way. I've been teaching microdosing programs for quite a number of years now. I started microdosing intuitively about 15 years ago with
Hmm.
psilocybin before, there was languaging around it. And it's just so amazing actually to just witness the way the psychedelic movement has evolved and refined and, that we have languaging around integration. 2 years ago, you never heard anyone talk about integration and now it's all over the place. It's part of our vernacular. Same with set and setting and same with, microdosing. And so I, over the past 10 years, have really cultivated a framework that integrates microdosing with tapping into flow states. And that's another area that has really developed. Thank you to, Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel and the Flow Genome Project. And, people who are interested in flow should read Stealing Fire. That's a great
Yeah.
place to start. It gave language to an experience that I was already having. And so, yeah, and then I started doing more research around this notion of creativity. I think it was an article that I read that IBM had done a study, and this was like a few years ago at this point, but they interviewed about 1,500 executives from around the world. And they called creative thinking one of the number one most important skill sets for the 21st century. And then I also read Yuval Noah Harari's book,
Yeah.
21 Lessons for the 21st Century and Sapiens. And he also said this. And then I started noticing it because I had heard it, then I started paying attention to it. And I really started seeing this pop up everywhere from experts from such a wide range of fields. We're calling creativity one of the most important skill sets that we can cultivate. And I was like, I'm not a creative person. Like, what do I do with this? And then I just started doing more research about it. And I'm also a big fan of Brene Brown and Elizabeth Gilbert. And I was listening to a talk that they were doing and on Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic podcast. And Brene was talking about that about 80% of people have had an experience in school that like negatively impacted the way they saw themselves for the rest of their lives. And I was like, wow, that's really big. And 50% of those 80% of people, that negative belief was around creativity, and research shows that a little over half of the US population believes that creativity is something you're born with. Either you have it or you don't.
Mm.
And so, and I had also a very strong experience in school where I was told because I couldn't draw that I would never be creative. I was also told by my third grade math teacher that I should never go into anything with numbers. And then I ended up getting a degree in finance. So,
Yeah.
I just, but that negative belief was always there. It was always kind of haunting me. And same with creativity. And I think for me, I'm really interested in changing the narrative around creativity, that it's so much more than your capacity for aesthetic art, and so for me, I still can't draw, but my narrative has changed so much around how I view myself as a creative individual. And I also became really interested in, over the years of working so much with psychedelics, just really seeing the way that they help us to shake up our framework and our models of reality and allow us to step out of ourselves to perceive things in a different way. And so I started doing a lot of research and I kept coming across, a couple of different programs. And I thought, this is something that I feel like it's actually the next step of where the psychedelic movement is going. Right now, so much is focused on, depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and for good reason, and especially I think that that's really the segue to sort of get FDA approval for these studies. And for someone like myself who's also experienced addiction and depression, once we heal from these experiences, it's like, what's next? And being in that cycle for myself, for years I struggled with addiction and depression, and it's like this ruminative cycle. And
Mm.
what's interesting to note is like the similar underlying neurological mechanisms that allow psychedelics to help heal depression and addiction and PTSD and anxiety are the same reasons that help us to think more creatively. Right? We're shaking up that neural snow globe. We're breaking that very deeply entrenched groove in the way that we think, and we're giving ourselves more flexibility to reach for a new thought. So it's been interesting because there's not like a ton of research right now in the space around creativity and
Right.
psychedelics. There is some, and I'm happy to talk about what is there and what it points to. But I feel like I'm really just connecting the dots in a way that make intuitive sense. And I'm really excited for where it's going. And I do think that this is where the conversation will sort of eventually lead to after we really kind of get a lot of this information around how it helps with mental illness. How do we also leverage these experiences for human optimal performance?
So maybe let's like, do you have a good definition of creativity you like to use? Like, because it's,
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
always say problem solving, but it's not just problem solving, right? It's more than that.
Right. Well, it's so interesting with creativity, and I thought, going into this program, I was like, this is kind of fluffy, like this is interesting, but it's actually so complex and it's so hard to pin down that it makes it a really challenging topic to study. And
Mm.
so there is a general definition in the field that most people agree on that creativity has two main components. One is novelty, originality, and the other is usefulness or relevance. So, something that's original, but also useful. And if we wanted to go deeper in the book, The Neuroscience of Creativity, author Anna Abraham adds another element to this definition, which is this
Mm.
element of surprise. How the brain reacts when you witness something new, it just invokes this element of surprise. And so she also attributes that to creativity. And then when we look at creativity, of course, we can start looking at there's the four P's of creativity, for example, which is Mel Rhodes' research: creative products, people, processes, and press, which is the environment that we're in that can help be conducive to creativity. So when we look at products, that kind of applies to that definition that I said. How useful is it? How relevant is it? How novel is it? But then when we start talking about creative people, then we're looking at a whole other set of definitions.
Mm.
The function of our attitude, for example. And then when we look at creative processes, which is something that I'm particularly interested in, I'm happy to dive into this one in particular. It's more a function of our cognitive fluidity.
Mm.
So when we think about creativity and creative thinking, we can start to understand this as a range of cognitive processes that can best be described as a dynamic, fluid movement between multiple states of mind. And of course, that's where creativity, where psychedelics really, really come in.
Mm. Yeah, totally. So, were you seeing like career breakthroughs with your clients? And that kind of like clued you into how important it was? Or was it individual like problem solving? You're like, oh, wow, I've never seen so many brilliant decisions like tied together. So, in such a,
Yeah.
yeah, what was going on there?
Yeah. Well, I noticed it primarily in my own life first, having these experiences of feeling like writer's block or stuck or having to make a decision and things are just like not flowing, to going into an altered state of consciousness where it was like distinctly different experience, like clear open channel clarity, feeling like energy moving in a different way, new ideas just like pouring forth. And so it was originally, from my own experience, and then really understanding the research around tapping into flow. And I have a bit of a different perceptual or conceptual framework around flow
Mm.
that really revolves more around understanding this dance that we're in with the frequency of inspiration. And so, that's definitely another channel we could go down. Yeah. And so I think it's also helpful to understand that there's cognitive tools that we can learn, that we can have in our tool belt and draw upon to help us think in a different way. Right. So it's like frameworks and processes and tools, and ways of thinking. And we're just not taught these tools. You know, most of our educational system encourages what we call convergent thinking. You know, so convergence, we're looking at one solution, and it's always about studying for the test and trying to get the one right answer. And we're not really taught skill sets in what we call divergent thinking, which
Mm.
is more open ended. So if I was to say to you, you know, what are all the different ways that you can think of to use a paperclip? I'm going to put you on the spot here, Joe. So, like, how can you use the paperclip?
um, Putting some papers together, picking a lock, cleaning out your bowl. I use it for my water filter to get extra airflow. Uh, what else? This reminds me of this exercise I was reading about in a recent NLP hypnosis book that actually does these exercise prompts daily. I was like,
Exactly.
whoa.
Well, it's actually it's tools that we can learn. And so
Yeah.
when you get really good at this, you'll come up with 40 or 50 different ideas. And so there's lots of, we know that at first we pick the low-hanging fruit. You're like, paperclip, let's put the papers together. But then you got to break through the low-hanging fruit and teach yourself how to, number one, defer judgment, you know, and give yourself permission to think outside the box, and also go for quantity. That's another big aspect. And this is just one example of a million tools that we have. You know, we take brainstorming for granted these days, but brainstorming was invented by Alex Osborne in 1953. You know, before that, there wasn't a vocabulary around brainstorming. And there are so many tools that we can learn. And I think, yeah, that's really where my interest is, especially because we know that after psychedelic experiences, we are in a state of heightened mental flexibility. And so can we leverage that window? And I think that's where I'm really fascinated about, like, you know, we're still in the infancy of how we're working with psychedelics and how we view it. And can we sort of create conceptual frameworks that allow us to work with psychedelics in a wide variety of ways, you know?
Yeah. Like, it's such a powerful tool, right? Like, we can do that with a paperclip, and there's probably like 1,000 answers, maybe more.
Hmm.
You know, if you had one of those things in ancient times, you'd probably be a genius. You know, the amount of things you could
Hmm.
do with it. But you know, these days you're just, you know, somebody with a paperclip. But you know,
Hmm.
psychedelics, what a powerful tool! Like, the the degree to which they can be leveraged by humanity is wildly untapped.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, and I could share a little bit
Sure.
about how psychedelics specifically help with, remember, in the four P's, process was one of them. And so there isn't a lot of research, but I've been really lucky to speak to one psychedelic scientist, neuroscientist, Manesh Gurn. I'm going to be releasing an episode with him on the podcast. It will probably be out by the time this is released. And so he's done some research with Robin Carhart Harris, and they wrote a book called Updating the Dynamic Framework of Thought, Creativity, and Psychedelics. That was a paper that they wrote, and it outlines, you know, the creative cognitive processes and how it relates to psychedelics. And so what's interesting is that, you know, there's sort of this myth of creativity that there's like those select few creative geniuses and that they have it all the time, you know, that it's like this fixed thing that's always there. But creativity and creative thinking, it's actually more of a process. And we can learn those skill sets, as I said, and the mindsets and the cognitive tools to help us think more creatively once we understand what the process is. And so when we talk about the creative process, there are different models that we can look at. And most models typically outline 4 to 5 different stages of creativity. But one model that's frequently referred to, which was created by James Taylor, who's an award winning creativity expert and entrepreneur, he outlines 5 critical stages of the creative process. So
Mm.
they do vary, but this one is, you know, his model. And so one is preparation, and then you have incubation, illumination, evaluation, and implementation. And so it's pretty, you know, straightforward. Preparation is where you're gathering and exploring information. Incubation is part of the process where you step back and you digest all the
Hmm.
information through subconscious processes like daydreaming and mind wandering. And then you have illumination, and that's like the aha moment. And so when we look at creative geniuses, we're always like, oh, we see the aha moment, but we forget that there's so much that goes into the process for them to strike that aha moment. And so mind wandering during the previous phase, the incubation phase, is really what allows insights to arise. That's why we often get our best ideas in the shower or driving home from work or hiking in the woods or during a psychedelic experience. And
Right.
then we have the evaluation phase, and that's time to evaluate. And this again, I referred to divergent and convergent thinking. And so, illumination and incubation are more divergent thinking, and then evaluation is more convergent. And then for those of you who have read Michael Pollan's book, he refers to some research around lantern consciousness versus spotlight consciousness. And I'll touch on that in a second, which is similar to convergent and divergent, which is so interesting that there's already such an overlap between psychedelics and creativity. There's just not a
Yeah.
lot of people like connecting these dots. So in the evaluation phase, we're looking at the different options and various path forward. And this is where, the original definition comes in of like what's original, what's novel, what
Right.
serves a useful function, is it commercially viable? And then we have the implementation phase. And of course, this is, where we create a plan or strategy to anchor the ideas into reality. So what's important to recognize here is that the different stages of the creative process require varying and dynamic cognitive states.
Mm.
So being a creative or fostering creative thinking, it's not about acquiring a fixed or singular mental state. It's much more about understanding the varying mental states as a dynamic process. And psychedelics just so happen to support that specific kind of cognitive flexibility that's beneficial to this creative process. So it's more of like a fluid movement between multiple states of mind. And some of those include like mind wandering or rumination or focused goal directed thinking. So we have like, the different aspects of convergent and divergent thinking. And so if you think about it, some of these mental states are more constrained, like spotlight consciousness, while other cognitive processes like daydreaming or mind wandering are enhanced by this experience of becoming untethered from the anchors of our mental constraints, which psychedelics happen to be particularly good at, untethering us. And so it's what we call unconstrained cognition. And this is really helpful, again, for the incubation and illumination phases of the creative process. And when we start going into, a big part of this comes from, I think you've interviewed Robin Carhart-Harris for this podcast.
We have not. We had one phone call with him once, I think, but we've
Okay.
not recorded with him yet.
Well, many people are probably familiar with his
Yeah.
work from Imperial College and on the entropic brain. And he talks about, the underlying neurological mechanisms that underpin the psychedelic experience. Well, it's the increased entropy in the brain, that state of mind that becomes less highly ordered than in like ordinary waking consciousness, that bodes well for the creative process. Where as we get older, we become more rigid in the way that we think and become, more rigid and less able to move in that fluid way between different cognitive states. And so when we're in the psychedelic experience, we could open up that rigidity and become more fluid, less constrained, go into more of what we call lantern consciousness. And Michael Pollan writes about this in his book How to Change Your Mind, and he cites research by Alison Gopnik, and she's the author of The Philosophical Baby. And she draws that distinction between, spotlight consciousness in adults, which of course is useful, gives us the ability to like focus attention and, be focused on a goal. And then lantern consciousness, which is much more present in young children and also a hallmark of the psychedelic state. So there's really, it's kind of obvious once you start looking at the research, and once we start connecting other dots, like there was another study that showed that people who work with psychedelics often report a tendency to see multiple viewpoints of a particular problem. So when we start looking at that, it's like, oh, okay, there's that cognitive flexibility that's coming in. And then of course there's research around psychedelics and openness. I don't know if you've interviewed Roland Griffiths or if you're familiar with, the personality changes that happen from even just a single dose of psilocybin. Are you familiar with that research?
Let's have you kind of give a stat,
Okay.
a recap of it.
Well,
Yeah, I don't follow him too
yeah.
closely.
And this is so interesting too, because Well, I'll tell you. So the study was led by researchers at Johns Hopkins, and they found that a single dose of psilocybin can create lasting personality change,
Hmm.
particularly in this personality trait known as openness. And it's really, what makes this so exciting, and as Roland Griffiths says, normally, if anything, openness tends to decrease as people get older, right? So that's like we go from lantern consciousness as children, and then as we get older, we get stuck in spotlight consciousness. So, and so for psychedelics to reverse that or to have an impact in that is actually quite remarkable, and it's something that we should be really excited about. And so openness it's a personality trait. It's one of five according to the big five personality theory.
Mm.
And we all happen to lie somewhere on the spectrum between, openness and sort of like contraction or like closed-mindedness. So you could ask yourself, how open are you to new ideas, to trying something new, to eating at a new restaurant, to making new friends, or to striking up a conversation with a stranger? Or how open are you to ambiguity and complexity and, and to the mystery and the flow of life? How open are you to listening to other people's opinions without getting defensive or contracting? How open are you to receiving feedback? So these are all sort of indicators of this personality trait called openness. And what's really interesting is that some of the factors that lend to this like the subsets of openness are flexible attitude, imaginative, adventurous, enjoys artistic aesthetic, broad-mindedness, likes to think in terms of abstract ideas. People who are open have more of a curiosity mindset, more comfortable with adversity, comfortable in the face of the unknown. There's a stronger tendency to pay more attention to inner feelings. And so, I mean, all of these things can also very much so lend themselves to creativity and to creative thinking. And when we look at the creativity research, the three big affective skills that we can learn to cultivate are, to enhance our capacity to be creative and creative thinking. And again, just like changing the narrative around what creativity is. So like we need creative thinking when we look at, engineering and science and business. I mean, it's like so much more than just music and dance and art. And so like the
Right.
three big affective skills that we can learn to cultivate if we want to start thinking more creatively is one, openness to novelty, and so again, that's like a huge overlap with openness, tolerance for ambiguity, and tolerance for complexity. And so those are all subsets of this personality trait of openness that we know that one dose of psilocybin can drastically alter. And that research was showing for some people that trait was changing for up to 14 months,
Mm.
from one experience. So there's some really big overlap here between psychedelics and creative thinking and creative problem solving. And so I'm just taking this and my own experience and I'm running with it in a direction that I feel like is really useful and beneficial to just such a diverse range of people.
Yeah. So hearing you run through all that, it's like the older folks at universities seem like prime candidates. Like there's this kind of like inherent kind of conservatism that
Hmm.
doesn't really accept openness or complexity sometimes. Well, they understand complexity, right? But it's like the way they've been doing things worked for so many years. So why change? Is there incentive?
I mean, and that's happening everywhere. Look
Totally.
at the division. We are living in such polarized times. And so,
Hmm.
people are just throwing shit at each other over social media, the far left, the far right. It's like, can you have the capacity to be friends with someone who voted for a different political party than you would have voted for? It's like being able to hold complexity in that way and stay open to other people's ideas. And I mean, gosh, we could go so far down, the default mode network and models of reality. And that's where I weave in a lot of the psychedelic science and the neuroscience and how we perceive reality. But there's so many interconnected pieces here, and there's a lot of ways that we can build a framework and connect a lot of dots, which in and of itself is inherently a creative thought process.
Yeah,
But
totally.
yeah, staying open to people's perspectives, I think it's a big
Mm.
part. I mean, and even unfortunately, we see this in plant medicine communities. where there are a lot of people who hold very, very strong opinions, and I respect those opinions. And I just encourage everyone who does find themselves on that spectrum of, getting really enraged with certain things and topics and conversation that come up, to understand that we need to hold nuance at the forefront and complexity, and stay open to other people's beliefs, even despite what we believe is right and wrong.
Do you see any relationship here with like I do. This idea of a paradigm shift coming from like this Newtonian Cartesian worldview of like dead matter, the world is dead, to like, this animist worldview where everything has value, like it's a really hard shift that I think we're gonna have to come up to if we're to
Mhm.
pull off this humanity project for another few hundred years. Like we're going to have to start understanding things have inherent value. There's a ton of interconnectedness. And
Oh,
like
yeah.
Newtonian
Yeah.
science wants to isolate and not really look
Mhm.
at relation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, that's really diving into what we understand about quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, which is another really fascinating aspect that I love to dive into. It's really where I actually spend most of all my spare time, is watching talks by Brian Greene and, from the people at the Royal Institute, talking about, theoretical physicists. And so I dive pretty deep actually into, and my understanding is fairly extensive for a non-theoretical physicist in terms of quantum mechanics. But I do think that plant medicines, they help us lift the veil of this illusion of 3D reality and separateness. And I mean, that's what also the psychedelic science is starting to show. Research shows that people walk away from these experiences with a greater sense of connectedness that actually inspires them to take action, like
Mm.
recycle, for example. So it's actually pretty amazing. But I have had so many experiences where I feel like those veils are getting lifted. And Tesla said, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, you have to understand energy, frequency, and vibration. And I think that there's more of a direct experience. This is actually something I was also talking to Dennis about, because I'm really curious about it. But I do think that, we can't solve the problems that we face on the same level that created them, as Einstein said. And I think that plants are like the impetus to help us, the catalyst to help us take this next evolutionary leap in consciousness. And we're facing a crisis of creativity right now. Almost everyone in the workforce comes from, an industrialized educational system that was built to design people for the industrial era, which now no longer exists. And so we're preparing children today for jobs that don't exist yet. So in our lifetime, things have changed. And I mean, I know that this is like kind of pointing out the obvious, but most people don't really take the time to recognize how fast things are changing. They call this a VUCA world now, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I've used these words, complex and ambiguous, a number of times now. And creativity and creative thinking really help us become more resilient, more flexible, more adaptable in the face of so much change. And rationally, we know that things are changing all the time, but emotionally, that's really hard for us to grasp, and it can be very wearing on us. And so how do we, cultivate our resilience in the face of change? It's like understanding that this tidal wave is coming our way, and we can teach our minds to pay attention in a certain way to the subtlety of the energy of that wave, to the vibration, the frequency, like teaching our minds to tune into a more subtle dimension of reality. Or we could be like focused on this solid 3D reality and be like, oh, that guy's cute on his board over there, or look at the pretty fish. And we just get like pummeled by the wave. So I think it's all a different way that we choose to show up right now. And I think plant medicines are like advanced training ground for teaching us how to ride this wave and how to thrive in the 21st century rather than be marred in chronic stress, illness, disease, depression, everything that we're witnessing at all-time highs right now. So I think it's all about fine-tuning our perceptual view of reality. And so my perspective is that by creating a conceptual framework we can teach ourselves. It's like almost like uploading a neurological program in the mind, which then allows you to perceive reality differently. And you can train yourself how to perceive in that way by taking that framework and that understanding into the psychedelic space. And that's pretty much the iterative process that I've been in for many years now. And that's essentially the framework that I teach people.
I love that. I'm wondering if you can give us like a little sketch of what microdosing coaching looks like in your world.
Yeah. hmm So I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of visionaries and a lot of executives. I also do, I primarily do group coaching. And so my signature program, I'm going to be running my next one in the new year. It's like a microdosing mastermind. And so I teach a lot of these frameworks around, and for people who are familiar with like Joe Dispenza's work, for example, I weave a lot of his work as well as, or he draws upon a lot of other, background research. So I really go to the source of all of that and really understanding like the neuroscience of transformation. I draw upon the research around flow states and also weave in quite a bit of Eastern philosophy. And I've created this framework that really creates a foundation for people to create a morning practice. So I have this framework called the 7M microdosing morning routine that I really love teaching. And there's a lot of different, sort of moving pieces to that. But when we look at the research behind flow states and we understand that it's really this optimal state of consciousness, and that when we look under the hood, there's like knobs and levers that we can start understanding, from brainwave states to neurochemistry, parts of the brain that fire and wire together and, are more activated. Like, for example, when we're in a flow state, the prefrontal cortex goes sort of offline and we sort of get out of our own way with the inner critic, for example. And so there's quite a lot of research now that allows us to look at like what allows us to tap into these states. And there's a really large overlap between microdosing and flow, because, and all the other sort of M's that I talk about, which include, movement and music and meditation and mind mapping. And then I also go into manifestation and what I call musings, like creative output. And so when we look at movement, for example, there's neurochemicals that get released, endorphins, for example. Music has also an impact on our brainwave states, depending on what music we're listening to, as well as the neurochemistry in our brain. And so when we start like mapping it out, we can create a framework that allows us to really build a foundation as like a launch pad for us to create ripe territory to tap into these flow states, which in my mind is really just dancing with inspiration. There's this quote I'd love to share with you by Pantajali.
Please.
And it really just encapsulates, for me, how I view flow.
This is the person who wrote Yoga Sutras.
Yeah, I love him so much. And, he's just so much wisdom. And he says, when you are inspired by some great purpose, some extraordinary project, all of your thoughts break their bonds, your mind transcends limitation, your consciousness expands in every direction, and you find yourself in a new, great, and wonderful world. Dormant forces, faculties, and talents become alive, and you discover yourself to be a greater person than you ever dreamed yourself to be.
Wow.
And that to me is really just what flow is. It's like this way that we can cultivate a relationship to this thing I call inspiration, that is really tied to something so much greater than us, where we get out of our own way. And I know I've heard some people make comments about like, oh, well, microdosing for peak performance is like, it's so egotistical. And my sort of response to that is that, if we're stuck in depression and addiction, we're not really going to be finding many solutions to the challenges that we face. And so a big part of my program is like really encouraging people to play big, to expand the boundaries of what they believe is possible, and to really create at a level that creates change, like in a real way, whether it's just in their immediate circles or, on a much larger scale, but to find solutions to the complex challenges that we face. And it's just offering people a framework for how to think about it, how to think about it differently. And
Yeah.
so for me, there's no greater way to, this is why I live. That quote is really why I live, for those moments. I mean, think about the last time you felt inspired by something. It's
Mm.
like something greater than you moved you into action. Like, where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where is that wellspring of energy? It's, to me, it's like spirit realm, quantum realm. I'm so grateful. I had this conversation that was translated by a friend with this shaman from Ecuador, and I was asking him about his viewpoint on tapping into the spirit realm. And I mean, what he said was like verbatim, like almost word for word, things that Einstein says about quantum mechanics. That the field is the sole governing agency of the particle. There are and he would say, you go into the spirit realm and you create there first, and then it's created in this realm. And when you think about it, everything we see in this 3D reality emanates from another dimension, and that dimension is really the source of all inspiration, creation. And this is the place that it's like, what's so interesting, we're so afraid of it because it's the root of impermanence. And it's that feeling of being in the void. When I talked about that proverbial rug getting pulled out from under under me when the volcano erupted, psychedelics teach us how to handle situations like that. Because if you've had those experiences of like really tapping into the void, we realize actually there's no ground to stand on here. And this is the foundation of some of the teachings in Eastern philosophy. There's nothing to hold on to. There's nothing to cling on to here. And that can strike terror in our hearts. And once we make peace with that, it's actually the source of all inspiration, that we can tap into that place, that void, and we can create from it. And that's the bittersweetness of life. And that's the bittersweetness of creating. And just to tie like a full circle here, think about creativity and creating not for the thing in and of itself. I am the person I am today because I built that retreat center with my partner. And even though we don't have it anymore, you can't undo who I became in that process. And so we think about it differently and engage with life from this way of creating because of who we become. We hold a vision of what we want to manifest, and creativity is just taking your ideas and manifesting them into reality. And so there's this conversation around creativity it's so parallel with Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics, like you were saying before. There's such a fluidity there. And when we start understanding, some of the basic tenets of quantum mechanics, I mean, you can't help but notice the overlap and how that overlaps with the psychedelic state and this experience of tapping into these open channels of creativity and allowing new ideas to come through and to really birth these visions into reality. So having a vision of building a retreat center and then going through that whole experience and all that it taught me and all that it made me is the process in and of itself. It's not about the thing. So when people are afraid to create, take the leap for the act of flying through the air, not because you think you're going to stick the landing. Create for the process in and of itself. And we're all creative, and we're all creating every day, all day with our lives. And we can choose to engage with it from this very sacred perspective. And I think that microdosing helps us to become more aware of that. And so a big part of the microdosing morning routine that I have and that I teach people, and that's just one aspect of the program. There's so much more information that I weave in, and embodiment practices and meditation, which I can touch on more. But such a big component is like, how do we bring ceremony into our everyday lives? How do we see and engage with creativity as something that's inherently sacred, that's our connection to spirit? And what does that look like? And can we sit at our desks and, create, whether it's the podcast, the books, the articles, whatever it is that you're creating as a solo entrepreneur and executive, any project you're getting off the ground, like, how do we see the sacredness in that process? And I think psychedelics and sacred plant medicines can help, bring that element of awareness into the process.
Mm. Well,
I know that was quite a long tangent.
There's a lot of depth there. I'm gonna have to crack open my Yoga Sutras soon. Potentially, it's how I pronounce it, but I need to just dig into that more because I've been away from that. But that used to be a really important book for me for a long time.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, and that idea, like peak performance being egotistical, that's like ignoring what's happening on the planet. Seems to me,
Yeah.
and
Well,
interpersonally and everything. Yeah.
I think you touch on something interesting there because I think everything comes down to intention.
Mm,
So I think there is very much so, this quality of focusing on peak performance from a place of like the drill sergeant and the whip and like I'm not good enough. I need to get over there and be better. And I think it's easy to fall down in that road. But then there's also like another aspect that we can choose to relate to it differently of like how much can I expand what I believe is possible to create with my life on this planet while I'm alive?
mm, hmm.
I think it's all in how we frame things. And so I don't have a negative relationship to peak performance, but I do see quite a tendency for a lot of people in that community to be really self critical, really harsh on themselves. And the antidote to that is just a lot of compassion, self compassion, a lot of patience, a lot of like loving yourself first and knowing that, you're okay and whole and complete and you don't need to like achieve more to find greater depths of wholeness.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, there's so much here. And I really appreciate this, like, it's kind of different microdosing paradigm, maybe is how we can frame it, of like
Mhm,
having a lot more there.
mhm.
Like, you just, if you're microdosing, jumping into traffic to do your, cubicle job that you hate, like, what really is that versus what you're talking about here, which is like bringing so much more attention and care to your life?
Yeah, it's so much in the intentionality and also what we understand about neuroscience and how we experience reality all has to do with like the conceptual frameworks that we have in our mind. So I really relate it to like, can I upload this framework in your mind for you to perceive reality from this perspective? And then what does that do for you in terms of how you choose to show up as a human being living on this planet? And I think it's time for a new paradigm. I think it's time for a way that we show up in a vastly different way. And that requires, that this is the path of the bodhisattva. This is not for the faint of heart. This is the path of fire in a lot of ways. You have to let go, you have to let go of old ways of being. And that's where you step into the void. But once you become more comfortable with that place of unknown and you see it as a source of energy and wellspring, it completely changes the way that you interact with life.
Can I run a paraphrased Roland Griffiths quote by you? I think I read it this
Sure.
morning and I've been ruminating on it quite a bit. Cool. So I think it is meditation is the true path. Psychedelics are the crash course. Any just like first brush impressions from that?
Yeah, that reminds me of another quote about integration where the psychedelic experience is like getting helicoptered to the top of the mountain and you erroneously believe that you made that climb yourself.
Mm,
I to me there's a strong parallel there and I say both and. I'm like, yeah, chopper me to the top of the mountain, like let's do this and then oh, I have this perspective of looking at myself all the way at the bottom and the daily practices that I need to embody every single day to make this climb, you know? And so I do think psychedelics are like a crash course. I call them a very advanced training ground. And again, so like my framework is like, you can go into the psychedelic experience without any tools recreationally, with it. It's like, it's so diverse. But what if we went into the psychedelic experience with a very diverse range of tool sets that we know how to draw upon to find deeper levels of healing, to open our minds to new possibility, to rewrite limiting beliefs that we actually teach ourselves outside of the psychedelic space and through practicing meditation as one of several practices that I think are foundational. So that when we go into the psychedelic space, we're rapidly catalyzing transformation, like much, much more quickly.
mm.
Mm-hmm. And
A lot more
meditation,
kind than me.
what's that?
You're a lot more kind than me. I, I had very, I had a very different, read when I experienced that. It was like, well, it's kind of like ruling out so many different traditions. Like
Oh yeah.
meditation
I
is the
mean,
only valid tradition, is how I read it. Like out of the whole world of traditions, I'm just like, that doesn't
yeah.
seem to vibe with me. There's a lot of groups that don't
Mhm.
meditate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much more of the buffet approach. That's
Yeah,
how I mean, and take the best and leave the rest. That's what my mom always used to tell me, you know? So it's
yeah.
like you find something that works and adopt it. And that's what I feel like I've been piecing together my own framework that draws upon, psychedelic science and Eastern philosophy and quantum mechanics and neuroscience and behavioral psychology. I mean, really, and I'm just picking the pieces that really make the most sense and watching how they fit together to help us in a way that makes sense to me, and it's been making sense to a lot of people that I've been working with.
Like that framework seems like, if folks have the time and room for that, like I think folks should be doing that for themselves. But in the meantime, find somebody that's done something that can work for you. That
Yeah,
seems
yeah,
what's fair to me. you know, like try to learn
yeah.
from teachers that are available, that are working for you.
One of the ways I see my microdosing programs are as like a very effective tool for integrating larger experiences and as like preparatory ground for going into deeper dive psychedelic experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it, right? Like I saw some kind of silly article a couple days ago. Are you ready? Because everybody knows about microdosing now, for the most part. But what about this next new thing, macrodosing? It's like,
Yeah.
what on earth? Like that made like Forbes or some kind of like big magazine. I'm like, what? How? so
Mhm.
like there, yeah, like realistically, we can leverage this microdose path, like meditation, yoga, whatever works for you, to help you prep for the big experience, which is, once in a while. It
Mhm.
shouldn't be all the time, really, for most folks, unless you're really ready
Mhm.
for that. But yeah, like we need to prep for these big things that are super valuable. And it's almost like in the Hindu world, like, or yoga world, doing austerities as like part of your ritual for,
Mhm.
a certain end.
Mhm.
Everybody's got a different metaphysic or like religious worldview. So it's hard to universalize. But it's almost like,
Mhm.
hey, guardian angel, like we're going to link up in like 6 months. So I'm doing all of this so that I can meet you in a better position.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's, it's one way to frame it. There's so many different ways to frame it. This is one of the reasons why I think we can talk about psychedelics for the next 50 years and not be bored.
I know, I know. I just like, don't get me started, especially when we start like drawing upon all these other modalities and understanding, different domains of knowledge and wisdom and
Yeah.
how I'm like, oh, that overlaps there and there's a really strong connection here and how come no one's pointing to this connection, It's just I just think it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Endless, right? It's unbelievable, really. There's so many different frontiers here. Like, throw out one pioneer, John Lilly, like this concept of like interspecies communication,
Mhm.
not to mention alien communication, but there's just so many interesting frontiers left.
Mhm.
The one, the relationship to self being probably the one that should be most primary to folks, but then understanding like self is a much broader concept than you might have initially understood.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm. So pandemic doesn't seem to be slowing down the next month or so. Do you have plans to offer retreats in Costa Rica when the time is right?
Yeah, I am really excited about what I'm cooking up for the future of retreats. I'm really excited to be working with this framework for more corporate teams and doing more team building with
Mm.
people who, I mean, right now, so many people are not in like physical contact with other people on their teams. And so teaching people, these cognitive processes for creative problem solving, which are actually really complex processes that I've been learning and incorporating them with the psychedelic experience. So
Mm.
research shows actually that creativity training works. And that's really good news that they do tests before and after. There's also been research we haven't touched on around ayahuasca, for example, helping to increase divergent thinking. There was another study out of the Netherlands with microdosing psilocybin, or actually it wasn't a microdose, it was a larger dose of psilocybin with truffles that also help encourage divergent thinking that we talked about earlier. And then there's also science showing that my friend Balder Arnheim, who is in the Netherlands, he has a PhD in the neuroscience of creativity. He did an amazing paper written in a journal that shows that when you teach people the underlying neuroscience of creativity, that also enhances the results of creativity training. And so it's really just linking in all of these pieces together. But yeah, I have some other really big fun projects up my sleeve. I'm really excited about. I'm creating Microdosing Coaches Alliance that I'll be launching in the new year for just so many people who are stepping into microdosing coaching and offering just a low monthly fee for people to come together, and offering free trainings throughout the month, a place for people to connect and share best practices, just all of these ways that we can be supporting each other. Yeah, and just making sure that we're doing the best that we can to hold space for this wave of microdosing and use of psychedelics in Western mainstream culture in the best way that we can, with responsibility and understanding. Like for me, I have medical doctors that I outsource to on my team. So anyone who's about to do any of my programs, understanding that there's medical intakes that we have to screen, even if it's small amounts and microdosing amounts, that when you work with someone, you can work with someone who is on antidepressants to help them come off of antidepressants with microdosing psilocybin, but you have to actually know what you're doing. And so there are risks, and especially when we start talking about microdosing Banisteriopsis caapi, ayahuasca vine, which is a very controversial topic, you really actually have to screen, and you have to let people know that there are contraindications medically. There are food contraindications. There are different levels of things that you need to be aware of with supplements, for example, timing of microdosing and when you choose to eat. And I know that there's some people who are very upset about this conversation, but the reality is that there's a lot of people selling Banisteriopsis caapi online without any of these disclaimers and without any screening. And so, because, for those of you who don't know, Banisteriopsis caapi is legal in the US. And so that's a whole other conversation, especially when we start talking about cultural appropriation. I've had some people really attack me, saying that teaching people to microdose with Banisteriopsis caapi is harming indigenous cultures. And I'm open to having that conversation. And I also am open to, my own perspective around the work that I'm doing. And I don't think I told you this, Joe, but I when I was in Costa Rica after my retreat, I'm pretty sure I had COVID. I never got tested, but I had all the symptoms. And I fell into a depression, which was really hard. And when I had 4 days of 104-degree fever. It was right after Envision Festival. Pandemic had just hit in a big way. My mom immediately was like, "You have COVID." And I was like, "I don't know." But then all this research started unfolding about like long-term effects. And so when I had really high fever, I was telling Noah, my partner, that I felt like the virus was attacking my brain. And then 3 months, I fell into chronic fatigue. And microdosing Banisteriopsis caapi helped heal my brain, like literally helped my brain heal. And it's a natural antidepressant. And so I think when we look at, suicide rates at all-time highs, and we see that there's a plant medicine that, I grow here in Hawaii because it's legal to grow. We grow it sustainably. We cultivate our relationship with this plant medicine. I'm not like ordering it from the Amazon. I'm like, living with these plants, and they're my way of life too now. And when you balance out, that we're living in an epidemic of depression and suicide, and there's a plant medicine that people can work with to not just help treat depression, but help, all of these other things that we've been talking about, open the creative channel, become more resilient in the face of so much change, more adaptable, more flexible, enhance creative thinking. I think that needs to be taken into perspective too when we start talking about this conversation of cultural appropriation. And I do believe in reciprocity, which is why I do give a percentage of my microdosing programs to various organizations that I think are important to support. And I also, on that note, support psychedelic sciences. I'm or psychedelic science and psychedelic research. I'm a big supporter of Unlimited Sciences from Dell. I don't know
Yeah, I
if you know
really
Dell.
like Dell. Yeah.
And the work that they're doing. I'm a part of their influencer circle called The Circle. And I help raise awareness for that too and encourage people to donate to that too. And so I think that when we are in places of optimal states of mental performance, not even calling it mental performance, but like mental emotional functioning, that we're much more in a place to find solutions, to want to give back. And so yes, on the one hand, I hear the conversation around cultural appropriation. And on the other hand, I'm like, would you have preferred that I committed suicide? Is that the preference, is like not to work with these plants and to fall into a depression where I'm not in a place to help anyone and I'm not even helping myself, or reach for, antidepressant pharmaceuticals? And for those of you listening who are really curious about the way that Banisteriopsis caapi ayahuasca vine works as an antidepressant, Dennis McKenna goes into it in depth. He touches on the pharmacology of ayahuasca and how it works as a natural antidepressant. And it's been one of my sources, my plant teachers, my allies, and I owe everything to this plant. And so grateful to all the indigenous traditions, which there are many, many different ways that people work with this plant medicine on this planet, not just from Peru. We look at so many traditions from Ecuador, Brazil. I mean, it's like so diverse in and of itself that I think we get into this mind frame that is just one way. But even within indigenous cultures, there's so many ways. So just bringing that like broader perspective to that conversation.
I've been learning a lot about peyote conservation in the States, and one group doing a lot of work there is IPCI, I think, and there's over 50 tribal interest groups, and the interest is so diverse, from like,
Interesting.
Losing, being really, really, really distraught that peyote is being grown internationally, to like, let's grow as much of it as we can. And this is inside like Native American, a lobby, like working really hard to promote peyote conservation. It's just incredible how much diversity there is. And, what is this? Being open to complexity. Like, we want a really simple answer because it's like evolutionarily efficient, but simple answers don't really do it most of the time.
Well, and even just recognizing, Joe, that we're trying to find solutions on top of very broken systems.
Oh yeah.
We're trying to find a simple solution embedded in a capitalistic system that is breaking down, that's not serving us anymore. I mean, and not totally throwing it out, but like learning that it's not totally functional. And yet, we just, I think that that's just like even good to have in our field of awareness that yes, the monetary system is real. It's actually still like the primary, system for economics. And that's what we're working with right now. So solutions are only going to be as good as the systems that support those solutions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like there's going to be a lot of interesting economic alternative models coming forward, but, until you can pay your landlord and whatever, there's going to be a lot of problems. I know people, there's a lot there. There's a lot we need to solve. And that's why we need creativity. And that's why I think we need psychedelics, all of these things, done intelligently. Yeah. Sure, I've done plenty of reckless things. In fact, I'll admit I've done plenty of reckless things, but, most, it was done intentionally recklessly, but there's so much room left to do so much more with good, intention. And there's just so much good left to be done on the planet. There's no lack of issues. Just pick a couple and go at it with kindness.
Right. I second that motion. I've done so many reckless things, and, we're not always perfect, but we're learning and we're growing. And that's the best that we can do, as individuals, as humanity, we're doing the best that we can right now.
Yeah. Well, Laura, Don, before we wrap, I want to kind of give you an opportunity to like, pitch anything that's going on or any other projects you want to mention.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, hats off to you, brother, for running this podcast as we started the conversation, off this call, that I'm 3 episodes in at this point. By the time this comes out, I'll probably be up to 10 or something. But I launched the Psychedelic Leadership podcast. It has been kicking my ass on so many levels.
Yeah.
It's a steep learning curve, but it's also been so rewarding. And I've been having amazing conversations, and I'm really grateful for committing to that process and that project. And I've thought about you as a source of inspiration multiple times, being like, damn, this guy's been going a long time and consistently too. And that's really hard. So for all of you guys listening, support the Psychedelics Today podcast, because it's not easy to do what these guys are doing. And my home base is livefreelauרד.com. And I have programs that I run with groups. I also do individual coaching. If you're curious about getting started with microdosing, I have a free 7-day or 8-day microdosing course on my website. I also have some free playlists, like an 8-hour music playlist for psychedelic journeys and beyond. And I also am on Instagram at livefreelauרד. And if any part of this conversation inspires you, intrigues you, triggers you, feel free to reach out and connect. I love having conversations with a diverse range of people, especially when it's approached from a place of kindness and curiosity. So and if you have any questions about the work that I do and how I support people one-on-one or through my programs, please reach out. You can find my contact on my website, livefreelauרד.com, and stay tuned for some of my next retreats that will be coming up in probably late 2021.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's our plan as well. Great timing. So thank you, Laura D. It's been really great. And I hope to do it again.
Thank you so much for having me on, Joe. It was such a pleasure dropping in with you. I really like your perspective on so many things too.
Thank you. And there you have it, Laura D. I hope y'all liked that one. It was pretty fun. I think we got into some great topics and covered a lot of ground from some cool perspectives. I'm a big fan of Laura D. and really excited to see what she's able to make happen in the next number of years and months. So yeah, be sure to follow her, get on our email list, and we'll have all sorts of links in the show notes for that. So be sure to tune in. And again, May 20, we kick off Navigating Psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. You can learn more at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And there are CEs available if you're a therapist, nurse, or psychologist. We're working on the CME stuff, but we've had a lot of doctors come through. So if you're interested, there are limited spaces. So sign up sooner than later, and we will see you there. All right. So yeah, again, sorry for not having a normal Solidarity Friday episode. We'll work on our software issues for next week. And I hope y'all have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.